When Russia invaded Ukraine, many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America did not join the United States and Europe in jumping to Kyiv's defense. Quite a few policymakers and pundits in Washington and other Western capitals were perplexed. Russia's redrawing borders, rewriting history, and trampling on Ukraine's sovereignty, much like European colonizers once did, they said. Why on earth aren't leaders in the global South taking Ukraine's side? But in many of those countries, there was a different reaction. Citizens and leaders were asking, why should we oppose Russia's aggression after watching decades of US interventions across the globe, from Iraq to Libya? But there was one very notable exception. In February 2022, just days before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, Martin Kimani, Kenya's ambassador to the UN, gave a stirring speech at an emergency session of the UN Security Council.
We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. We rejected irredentism and expansionism on any basis, including racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural factors. We reject it again today.
Welcome to Counterpoint. Each week we'll look at one pressing question facing world leaders from two opposing points of view. Today, we're going to tackle the question, should the global South denounce Russia's war in Ukraine as an act of imperialism? I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky, a deputy editor at Foreign Policy and your host and moderator for the show. Today's episode was recorded in front of a live audience during UN General Assembly Week in late September. My guests were Vijay Prashad, the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and the author of more books than I can count, including Red Star Over the Third World and The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. And Martin Kimani, Kenya's former ambassador to the United Nations and director of the Kenyan National Counterterrorism Center. He is now executive director of New York University's Center on International Cooperation. Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Let's get started. Martin, I'd like to begin with you. Do you see Russia's war in Ukraine as an act of imperialism?
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here, Sasha, and nice meeting you, Vijay.
Very nice to be with you.
I've probably Googled Vijay more than anyone else has in his life before. Was it an act of imperialism? Yes, it was. And I still believe we should reject it. But that is a point of view that I think simply reflects the facts as they are.
Say more about that. So beyond the facts as they are, how are countries in Africa in particular looking at this conflict?
Well, I don't think there's a uniform picture that applies to the whole global South. But certainly, I think there's a degree of sympathy for Russia because of the perception that Russia is responding to NATO. And there's also a sense that the United States and other powers have been also similarly imperialistic, and therefore there should be a uniform standard of judging them. But I think all these kinds of positions reflect their own double standards, which is if it was wrong, for instance, for America to invade Iraq, then it is wrong for Russia to invade Ukraine. And you have to be consistent. And I think a lot of leaders who are sort of sympathizing with the Russian position are not being consistent. And I think they're being disingenuous.
Vijay, let's go back to this question of imperialism. Do you think Russia's efforts to redraw the borders of Ukraine, are those efforts comparable to what happened in the 19th century when European powers tried to dismember Africa?
Well, firstly, I'm really happy to be here. And I'm actually ecstatic that Foreign Policy magazine has decided to talk about the word imperialism. It's great, and I hope there'll be more such forums on imperialism in the future. But I very much don't accept that what happened in February 2022 is imperialism. I think it's an act of war. Lots of countries go to war. When India, for instance, went to war against Pakistan in 1971, to end the genocide taking place in what becomes Bangladesh, was that an act of imperialism or was that an act of war to stop a genocide? Or for instance, when Vietnam crossed the border into Cambodia to end the killing fields against the Cambodian people, that was an act of aggression, of imperialism, or was that an act to end the genocide taking place in Cambodia. You see, if you start the story, and I think this is where a lot of countries in the global south develop their understanding of what's happening in Ukraine. If you start the story with the day the Russian forces enter Ukraine, then it's inevitable that one would talk about it as an act of aggression. But if you look back, United States unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Donald Trump withdrew in 2019. This created anxiety in Russia. The Russians asked repeatedly, in fact, put a treaty on the table in December of 2021. The Biden administration rejected everything. Now, I'm not saying Russia should have entered Ukraine, but I think that this question cannot be seen in a static light. One has to see these things historically. Ukraine has to live next to Russia. It's not going to be able to be moved from its neighborhood. They have to have an understanding with the Russians. The Baltic states have to have an understanding with the Russians. Georgia has to have an understanding with the Russians. They are neighbors. There has to be security guarantees.
Martin, I'd like to go back to you because when you gave that speech at the UN, it was 2 or 3 days before the invasion began. And I remember at the conclusion of your speech, you said multilateralism is on its deathbed tonight. Do you think that Vijay's argument that Russia deserves credit for trying to resolve this through negotiations is valid, and to put the onus on the Biden administration? How do you see it having been at the UN during those crucial months before the war?
Well, Sasha, one of the things that I want to be very clear about is that I am not carrying water for the US administration or for the Biden administration. America's double standards and hypocrisies are clear. What I was trying to say is that for the rest of us who do not have nuclear weapons, who do not have large, powerful armies, who must resolve the problems that we have in different ways, there are many countries around the world that have problems with the neighboring states, right? Including in Africa. But not every country that has a problem is able to roll tanks across a border. And we have to be consistent in calling out actions that undermine the aspirations to live in a world where bullies don't roll across borders. Today, if Russia's reasoning stands and other countries pursue similar actions, the world will be full of war. So I think, yes, Russia may have had and did have some genuine security concerns. Certainly, the expansion of NATO has been something deeply uncomfortable and perhaps intimidating to Russia. But of course, the countries that NATO has expanded to also say that they are intimidated by Russia, which is why they're in NATO. Look, we cannot have a world of two sets of rules, one for the powerful and one for the rest of us. And that is what I was trying to really defend. I was not there to defend superpower games. I was there to speak for all the countries that have been ravaged by imperial powers and to say we reject that notion of international politics.
It's interesting what you say, because just to make 2 points about that. I mean, let's go back to the African continent. I'm a close observer of the US administration. Obviously, I don't carry water for them either. But it's really interesting. In this year, there was an election in Rwanda. The Rwandan president won by 95% of the vote.
Or 99, according to him.
Let's not get too precise about this, because we might upset some people. United States was perfectly happy with that. I mean, for all the agita over the elections in Venezuela, it's very interesting that nobody seemed to care that in Rwanda, Paul Kagame wins basically with 100% of the vote. But when Mr. Kagame sends his troops into Mozambique, or when he sends his troops, whether through M23 or, as the Congolese government argues, actual Rwandan forces crossing the border into the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's backed by the US government. I mean, I quite agree with you. I'm not one who says double standards should rule.
First of all, Vijay, I think you sort of agreed with me. You don't want countries to invade one another. So why not just say that and say that about the Russian invasion?
It's an interesting issue. I'm not in favor of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. I wish it could have been prevented. But the question is, what provoked the invasion? Let's not forget that Volodymyr Zelensky was elected on a mandate of peace, on a mandate of negotiation with Russia. Let's also not forget that after the Russian tanks rolled into the Donbas region of Ukraine, the Ukrainians and the Russians sat in Belarus. They started a negotiation process. They then went to Ankara, Turkey. Boris Johnson shows up in Kyiv, goes for that funny walk in the middle of what was, the guy is a comical character anyway. Your Prime Minister, Sasha, because you live there, walks around Kyiv with Mr. Zelensky and says, we will not, allow any negotiation. And then Lloyd Austin travels to Kyiv and makes a public statement, which was, I think, extremely, unfortunate for a high official of a country like the United States to make in the middle of a conflict. He says, we will not back down because we have to weaken Russia. This is not the language that we expect in the service of multilateralism.
But let me stop you there. Are you saying that Ukraine is just a pawn then? Don't they have agency?
No, I'm not saying at all that Ukraine is a pawn. But I am saying that Mr. Zelensky was elected on a mandate of peace. And that's exactly what he tried to pursue. But at some point, Mr. Zelensky was boxed in.
Let's let Martin respond. He had something to say.
All conflicts end in negotiation. Why not end it now with negotiation?
Martin?
Okay, the way Eurocentric geopolitics works is by perpetually placing in the center of all our attentions the thinking and the actions of powerful Western countries. So Vijay, you are talking more about the United States than about what actually happened. What we need to see emerge is, one, multipolarity is coming. The United States will no longer be the unipower globally. There will be other poles of power. The question we have now is, will it be a multipolarity of invasion, oppression, or will it be a lawful and orderly multipolarity? And the idea that Ukraine is a proxy or Ukraine is a mere pawn in the hands of other countries robs Ukraine of agency. And that kind of robbing of agency, we Africans know it. We know it very well. Whatever actions we take are only actions that reflect the interests of greater powers. And so I think, Sasha, the question is not United States versus Russia. It is rather the creation of a separate block of countries, the majority of countries, to come together and uphold international law against the whims of the powerful. And that's really the point I'm trying to make. But I think, Vijay, you are so focused on the United States that you miss that we have to hold Russia accountable just as much as we have to hold the United States accountable.
It's interesting that you say that, because, I'm very rarely accused of Eurocentrism. So that's fascinating. But let's take an example of why the United States needs to be taken seriously. Not for itself, but for its behavior. There was a crisis, serious crisis in Libya. I was reporting from that region. I was reporting from Iraq. I know what a war looks like. It's not something that I would, fly a flag for. It's horrible. But when the conflict broke out in Libya, the African Union was taking a very active role. A plane was prepared. Jacob Zuma, then president of South Africa, was on that plane, part of the delegation. Several heads of government ready to fly to both Tripoli and to Benghazi. And the French government said, you can't go, we're going to start bombing. So it's not a question of, me imposing the US into the conversation. The United States imposes itself into these conversations. And in fact, doesn't allow the rest of the world to breathe. What are US ships doing in the South China Sea? The United States now working with the Australians to expand the runway in Darwin, Australia, so they can land aircraft there carrying nuclear weapons in violation of the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is a multilateral treaty negotiated by the South Pacific countries, which says this is a nuclear-free zone. So it's not me bringing the United States into the conversation. Somewhere in this room, Martin, and I don't know where it is, maybe sitting in here, is US officialdom. And they seem to want to insert themselves either diplomatically or by gunfire.
We've drifted quite far from Russia and Ukraine to the South Pacific now. But let's come back to this.
It's one world, Sasha.
To Martin,
it's one
because
world.
It sounds like what Vijay is saying is that U.S. militarism globally and NATO expansionism in the case of Libya is actually a greater threat to global stability than Russian expansionism. What do you make of that line of reasoning?
I think more Americans should be anti-US militarism, not because of solidarity with others even, out of just pure self-interest in maintaining America as a republic. So it's not out of turn to point to American militarism. It's not out of turn to point to American hubris and even acts of cruelty and definitely illegality. But we have to be consistent. The intellectually honest position to take is that if basing nuclear weapons in the South Pacific is wrong, then it is also wrong for Russia to start basing them in Belarus, right? The reason it's so important is not merely to pay lip service to the idea of consistency, but is to try and create a real groundswell of opinion amongst global citizens that understands that the maneuvers of great powers are mostly at the expense of all of us, right? And if we're not intellectually honest in saying this is illegal and this is illegal, then eventually the great powers use that sort of contradiction to advance their own interests. This is not about America versus Russia. It is about great power being used to bully, harass, and invade others, and us standing against it.
You're listening to Counterpoint. Today's episode was recorded in front of a live audience in late September. We'll be right back. Anti-imperialism is often seen as synonymous with anti-Americanism. Do you think that non-Western powers can be imperialists too, Martin? And can self-described liberation movements become enemies of liberation?
At some point, I think there used to be, and Vijay is a better historian than I am, but there used to be a left that was able to see a perspective of anti-imperialism going beyond just the West and being able to recognize imperialism anywhere it occurs. But over the years, it has become extraordinarily focused on the United States, extraordinarily focused on the West, due in large part, of course, because of how these countries have been behaving. But I would say that we do need to go back to a left position that is more honest in calling out imperialism when it sees it.
Vijay, do you think the left failed on that?
No, not at all. I mean, in fact, I think the hand-wringing that takes place is often excessive. I very much agree with you. We need intellectually honest positions. And the most, I think, credible position in all these conflicts is to call for immediate ceasefire and negotiations. And I don't see why Western countries are blocking negotiations in Ukraine.
I know negotiation. That negotiation that was happening in Turkey was a negotiation for Ukraine's surrender. It was not a negotiation for Ukraine to be able to stand as a free sovereign state. Now, remember the Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And Ukraine was promised safety by the Russians, right? This doesn't look like that safety. So if they then now negotiate a peace agreement, how can they guarantee their future independence? Because what has been being put on the table is essentially disarm and be completely available for us to do with as we wish. That is not a negotiation. That is an act of surrender. Now, hold on.
You wanted an argument. This is going to be an argument.
Does that mean that NATO is pursuing the right actions? I don't think it does. But to tell Ukraine, disarm yourself, bare your throat to me, and this constitutes peace, that's not peace. That's just waiting for the next time the next guy gets pissed off enough about whatever and decides to invade.
It's interesting. Every time it looks like we're going to start disagreeing, you throw something on the table that messes up the disagreement. Because I mean, the issue is, of course, the Budapest Memorandum, but it's also the handshake agreement between Edward Shevardnadze and James Baker, which said that the Soviets at the time were going to accept the unification of Germany as long as NATO didn't move 1 inch beyond the east of the new German border. And of course, NATO advanced, including talking to Russia about joining NATO. I'm actually a person that believes that NATO is a very dangerous force on the planet now. NATO's ambitions, what Ivo Daladier wrote, in 2006, Global NATO. We have a UN Charter. The UN Charter is the most important document in the world because it's negotiated and agreed by all countries. It's the only binding charter that all countries agree to. It's a very important sacred document. The UN Charter doesn't permit a force like NATO to operate on its own. It's illegal. If you don't have a UN Security Council resolution on Chapter 6, you can't enforce third-party sanctions. And Chapter 7 is interesting because after the vote in UN Resolution 1973, when South Africa, Brazil, other global South big players abstained from Resolution 1973, which gave a Chapter 7 resolution saying any member state can act to intervene in Libya, and NATO intervened. After that, the South Africans, the Brazilians and others said, we will never give a Chapter 7 resolution, again open-ended like this, because NATO exceeded the mandate. I think the world needs to really come to some understanding of NATO's self-identification as a global policeman, going out there bullying small countries around the world.
But
I
Vijay,
think this is a serious issue because Libya today is in a harrowing situation. There is no government. Whatever problems one might have had with the Gaddafi government, human indicators were all extremely good. Now the country is absolutely destroyed. And NATO will not be held accountable for this. We can't just allow these things to, just happen
Vijay,
and give it up. If we don't go back and do an accounting, then we don't have a policy. Then all you have is history.
Vijay, if this were a debate on Libya, we wouldn't have a debate. Because I'd agree with you.
Yes.
Right?
Which is why I want to use the Libyan example.
But let me, and I do think, by the way, that this war in Ukraine is going to leave behind a much weakened, if not shattered, NATO. NATO is revealing itself not as a world force, but really as a shell and an appearance of great power. But my problem is that I have Estonian friends, Latvian friends, and when they hear someone characterize their membership of NATO as them being sort of pawns, they get deeply offended. And I see why, because they feel that they need safety from Russia. And when they describe the experience of being in the Soviet Empire, because that's what it was, and I, as somebody who knows enough about our colonial history, there's so many points of commonality. So I see their desire for security. I see their desire to assert their own interests, and I respect that. One of the things I've told them sometimes when we're having discussions on this issue is that after 1990 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the countries in Eastern Europe that had been part of the Eastern Bloc rushed to become part of the quote-unquote idea of the West. And in that way, they've shown over the years very little solidarity with other post-colonial states. And then when the moment came now of this last invasion, they then called on that solidarity and found it not there. One of the really important things that needs to emerge is that countries that were in the Soviet Union need to understand the need for solidarity by countries that have been similarly oppressed by great powers. And if they do that, then their call for solidarity will get a more welcoming audience. But do they have genuine concerns about a Russia that bullies its neighbors, that sees Russian-speaking populations as wedge populations that allow it to invade and insert itself into the affairs of its neighbors? Yes, it does. And for that reason, if I was a Latvian diplomat, I would have tried to join NATO if I could.
But it's interesting. The word pawn and proxy was used by the two of you, not by me. I don't see these countries as either proxies or pawns. I understand people have security concerns, but I question them. I would caution them. Say that, look, I get that you have security concerns, but is joining NATO the best guarantee of your security, or is that going to create even more problems for you? And we need to think creatively about different forms of security. Why not impanel a UN commission, have a special session? Let's talk about the security of small countries next to large countries. Let's have a big open debate. Let's talk to China. Let's talk to Russia, India, Brazil. These are all big countries. In Africa,
Hold on,
country.
Vijay. But do Russia and China really care about the security of small countries nearby?
I think so.
Do they?
Yes, because they have to. Because, for instance, let's take an example. Let's look at the issue of Southeast Asia. China went to war against Vietnam in 1979. That was a ridiculous, stupid war, in my opinion. I think all sides now understand that that war was meaningless, should not have happened. Chinese-Vietnamese relations have improved dramatically. With Cambodia, with Laos, these are very good relations now. They are seriously interested in having a trade relations with small neighbors, including in Central Asia, and not going out there and stamping all over them and building military bases. There are no Chinese military bases in Central Asia, but there's a lot of Chinese rail line, there's a lot of Chinese factories, there's a lot of Chinese trade. This has improved life expectancy in these countries. Afghanistan is not going to be improved by another invasion. It will be improved with more trade, with better openness to the world and so on. And that's what at least China is interested in doing. So I actually think if there was a push in the United Nations, if countries came there and said, we want a special session, we would like a commission on small states and security, I think that could at least put us somewhere towards the conversation. You know, what we want is to advance the agenda. That's what we're looking for.
So, Martin, you know it from the inside. You've been at the UN. Do you think that that's realistic? I imagine that your colleagues from the Philippines at the UN might object to some of the things that Vijay just said about China only having good intentions.
I didn't say only.
Okay,
but that's again your word.
So, something you said about the joining of NATO reminded me of my favorite Kissinger saying, which is, it's dangerous to be America's enemy. It's fatal to be its friend, right? But look, I moderated a session of small states just this week at the UN. Singapore was there, Fiji, and all small island developing states all attended the meeting. And the meeting was precisely about this matter, about how can we be secure in a world of superpowers that may want to invade or oppress us in some way. And I think the way to defend the UN Charter for small states is not necessarily with a discussion between China, the United States, Russia, etc. It's when all small states or smaller states stand together. So small states are already discussing how to be safer. And how are they safer? They're safer by the UN Charter being consistently defended by every country. And that's why it's so important for Global South countries to actually come out and call out Russia. I think we need a third force. I think one of your books is about the darker nations, right? And that is really a book about the history of what used to be called the Third World, a bloc that stood on its own and understood itself as distinctly different from the superpowers. And that is, I think, what I aspire to.
I want to go to the audience now. Please, let's make these direct questions, not speeches, not observations, not comments, just questions. In the back, next to the Counterpoint sign in the red.
Hi, thank you. I just have two quick questions. One, Mr. Kimani, I'm wondering what you do think about the Kenyan invasion of Somalia, since they did enter with troops in that case, and how you sort of imagine and understand sub-imperial powers or regional powers in that context. And for Vijay, I'm wondering what you think about the Chinese genocide of the Uyghur population, since you've been sort of touting them as kind of the good guys in this context, and yet there is a genocide happening within the state.
I'll let Martin take the first and then Vijay.
So in 2011, when the Kenyan armed forces entered Somalia, it was in hot pursuit of al-Shabaab militants, terrorists, who had been coming into Kenya, attacking Kenya, kidnapping people and spiriting them across the border. So Kenya went in to try and track and capture those militants. And we invoked Article 51 in self-defense, as we're allowed to do by the UN Charter. And soon after, we rehatted into an African Union mission, which has a legal mandate not only from the African Union, but from the United Nations as well. So to characterize Kenya's action as an invasion is wrong, both substantively and legally.
Vijay, on China?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I like the way you answered that question. I'd probably answer my question similarly. Most people in the world had no idea anything about the Uyghurs or about Xinjiang as a province of China until a German right-wing conservative whose office is right next to the Langley office of the CIA wrote a report about this. It is true that China had a serious problem in the Xinjiang province because similar to the issue of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda groups in Afghanistan were training people from the Uyghur population. I met some of them in Idlib in Syria, and there were acts of terror. But the Chinese government decided to do something interesting. Rather than go and bomb these cities, United States did that in Afghanistan, you just go and carpet bomb a city. They didn't do that. They brought in people who they felt were maybe terrorists or whatever, and they had these de-radicalization camps. Now, whether you like what they did or not, to call that a genocide, I think, is a bit much. There was a serious problem. They dealt with it how they dealt with it. I don't necessarily agree with how they dealt with it, but I don't think we can use the Convention Against Genocide loosely and rhetorically to characterize things as a genocide.
We're going to take one more question. The woman in the green here in the middle row.
I want to thank you for your insightful commentary. I do have a question for Mr. Prashad. You did indicate, or seem to indicate, that the invasion of Ukraine or expanded invasion of Ukraine would not have happened if the U.S. had not withdrawn from the arms deal in 2019 and walked away from negotiations in 2021. However, Russia has seen Ukraine as the birthplace of their empire and the origin of their story for hundreds of years, and they invaded Crimea in 2014 before we walked out of the arms treaty in 2019. So what do you see as the evidence for that they would not have invaded, eventually at least, if we had stayed in that arms treaty?
You know, one of the interesting things about the story of the collapse of the USSR was that when it happened in 1991, it was pretty stunning to me that it didn't result in a number of border conflicts immediately. Because when the Soviet Union was created, it was created not exactly to have, national states. Even though they were the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Ukraine, as it was constituted, was not just Ukrainian speakers. It was inevitable that these kind of problems were going to occur. As far as Crimea is concerned, it's not just Crimea. There are two warm water ports that the Russians had been concerned about after the collapse of the USSR. One is in Crimea. That was a very important warm water port for Russia. The other is in Tartus in Syria. Russia took control of Crimea in 2014 and entered Syria in 2015, September, to defend its port in Tartus. If Russia lost these two ports, they don't have a warm water fleet. I think that was much more a hard-nosed military decision about their warm water ports.
Okay, Martin, I'd like to give you some final words. Would you like to respond to Vijay's comments about Russian intervention in Syria and in Crimea? Is it just legitimate strategic defense?
I didn't say legitimate. You said legitimate.
Yeah. It sounded
very interesting.
It sounded like you were saying.
No, I just described what happened. That doesn't mean it's legitimate.
Okay, what is it then?
It's what happened.
It's strategically defensible?
From their perspective, it was a military decision. It wasn't a decision about several hundred years of emotional attachment to that part of the world. That's what I was answering.
Martin, I'll let you respond.
Look, having worked as a diplomat, I have an inkling of how powerful states feel, which is that their power must be everywhere in the world. They seek power for its own good. They seek power to create wealth for themselves. And I'm not talking about for their people, for themselves, right? And When Vijay talks about Russia needing its warm water ports for its navy, why? So that it can range across the world showing its power, right? And the problem is one of the things that power does is that it blinds those who have it. And ultimately, I do not see how this power profits these empires. I do not see how Americans are better off being trillions of dollars in debt and sending American children to war all over the world. I do not see how that benefits the United States. Similarly, I do not see how it benefits the Russian people for Vladimir Putin to be the world's most powerful person. I think power needs to be constrained. I think power needs to stay within its own borders. And I think that kind of international system is the one that we should all be fighting for.
On that note, we're going to end. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to my guests, Martin Kimani, Kenyan's former UN ambassador, executive director of the NYU Center on International Cooperation, and Vijay Prashad, historian, journalist, executive director of Tricontinental. Thanks to both of you. And thanks to all of you in the audience. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you, Sasha.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Our production staff includes Karen Given and Dan Efron, with special thanks to Claudia Tatey. Join us next week as we debate how should Trump tackle the U.S. immigration crisis. If you're enjoying Counterpoint, please tell a friend. You can also leave a rating or review on your podcast app. It helps other listeners find our show. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. Thanks for listening.